study of Buddhism is quite polymorphous. There are lots of different strands, and it's very difficult at times to kind of hone in and get a grip on what it is. But I'm going to try and do that because as a philosopher, I'm not really interested in contingent historical details. I'm interested in, truth. And I think that Buddhist philosophy, especially Buddhist philosophy in its early Indian guide, which is sometimes called the Theravada school of Buddhism, is a deeply coherent and powerful philosophical model of the mind. And it is buoyed by and anchored by a very robust moral psychology, which I think, when understood in the cosmological context of Buddhism, which we'll talk about in a minute, is a very extended cosmological context, that this school of Buddhism can give us a very powerful lens for thinking about our relationship to animals. Because what it demands of us is that we understand what types of beings we are in virtue of our relationship to other types of beings that might exist. And the animal realm, as it's called, is only one possible realm. There are many realms. So, to zero in on the question, basically what I'm going to try and do is think, if you go to a Buddhist studies talk, you'll often see people talking about, the mythological dimensions of animals in Buddhism. Right? There are entire volumes of literature in the Pali Buddhist canon that concern these kinds of wise animals that have characters and personalities, and that represent the previous births of certain influential members of the Buddhist order, be it the Buddha himself or his main disciples. And there will be these allegorical stories of these, intelligent talking monkeys displaying wisdom to others. So this is a very core dimension of how animals function in the Buddhist corpus. Additionally, there are sort of sociological studies. You go into the countries, you go into northern Burma, and you look at how people have lived through this religion and how their attitudes towards animals, as informed by the monastic order, impacts their lives. That's another way to do these things. I'm not interested in these things. I don't think that, I think they're useful, I think they're super interesting, but for today I want to scale out, and I want to sort of give you a really quick, fast and dirty understanding of what Buddhist philosophy of mind looks like, what its moral psychology is, and plug that into a very basic conception of what the cosmology looks like, and then see if we can extract from that some lessons about what it means to live well, and what living well demands of us in terms of our actions towards each other and towards other creatures, animals, and the invisible beings, should they be out there. So, as I was saying at the beginning, there's, in Buddhism, all forms of Buddhism, there's what I like to call an extended cosmological context. Okay? What that means is that the world is divided up into different planes of existence. There's an immaterial plane of existence, a fine material plane of existence, and a material plane of existence. The metaphysical details are irrelevant. And there are different realms within that. And there are different orders of beings that exist within these realms. And the main ones that we want to think about, so there are, we have what's called here the hell realm, which is at the bottom. So this is just a beautiful kind of Tibetan ornamental version of this more schematic diagram. So the lowest realm is the hell realm, and that's where people go when they're reborn because of terrible things that they've done. Every mental and physical action that you take on in life has a causal consequence that not only reverberates throughout your own life, but in subsequent rebirths as well. So there are certain things like matricide, for example. That's like a one-way ticket to hell. There's no coming back from that, right? So the hell realm is like where people go who are reborn, who've done terrible things in previous lives. Then there's the realm of frustrated craving or clinging, and this is where the beings that inhabit this realm are called the hungry ghosts, right? And the hungry ghosts are people who in previous lives have lived with a sort of a psychology that's really rooted in craving and desire, and they've developed pathological attachment patterns to certain types of stimulus. Sexual desire is a paradigm case, and this is the realm where people go who sort of like live their lives in a really sort of heavy karmic weight, in the sense that they're really wrapped up in sensory pleasure, which is for Buddhists a no-no. And then there's the realm of animals, right? And the realm of animals is characterized here in terms of the life of that being is rooted in basic needs for survival, instinct, and self-preservation. Okay. And now I'm gonna skip the human realm, and I'm gonna go up to the higher two. Okay. So then there's the deva realm, which is sometimes called, and this is the idea of there are sort of two godly realms. Imagine them for those of us who are living in a Christian world. Think of it as angels and demons. Okay. The idea is that there's kind of like an elevated, fine material sphere of spirits, and some of them are malicious, and some of them are malevolent, and some of them are really benevolent and nice. And they kind of form, sort of like I think about it in terms of like the Greek gods. That's a nice parallel. And then there's the heavenly realm, which is like pure consciousness, where these are sort of, they're called Brahmas, the gods that live there, and they're made of pure consciousness. And then right in the middle of all this action is the human realm, right? So there's a bunch of really refined levels of existence above the human realm, and a bunch of coarser, more painful realms of existence below the human realm. And so Buddhists believe that the human realm is unique because there's a balance found nowhere else in the extended cosmos between pleasant states and unpleasant states. And because of that balance, there's a possibility that exists in no other place for an agent within that realm to be aware of the interrelationship that exists between pleasant and unpleasant mental states, and that proper awareness of that relationship can facilitate, I'll use a $10 word, soteriological progress that can't be made in other realms. Namely, beings can become fully enlightened in the human realm because of their capacity to understand the really subtle relationship that exists between the pleasant and the unpleasant. Beings that live in the higher, more refined realms can't do that because they're so blissed out all the time that they can't see how bad it can be. And beings in the human realm can't do it because their existence is so there's so much privation that they can't calm down enough to sort of see the true nature. So that's the big picture context within which the Buddhist moral psychological framework is in play. Okay, so now some basic doctrinal background. The 5 moral precepts are to abstain from taking life, to abstain from stealing, abstain from sexual misconduct, abstain from speaking lies, and abstain from ingesting intoxicants. And there are 3 levels at which a person should sort of try and internalize these rules. Action is the most coarse, right? Don't kill things, right? But then, these things filter into subtler levels, right? So not only should you refrain from the level of physical action from being violent in nature, you should refrain from being violent in speech. And indeed, at more refined levels of development, even the train of thought itself becomes pacified of aggression in ideal cases, right? So there's a very... there is such a thing as thought crime in Buddhism, right? There's a sense in which it's it behoves one to undertake this moral training such that spiritual progress can be made. So I want to give you a quote here. It's one of my favorite quotes from the canon. It's just to give you an idea of the Buddha is pulling no punches. He's playing for keeps. So even if bandits were to carve you up savagely limb by limb with a 2-handed saw, he among you who let his heart get angered, even at that, would not be doing my bidding. Even then you should train yourselves that our minds will be unaffected, and we will say no evil words. We will remain sympathetic with a mind of goodwill, with no inner hate. We will keep pervading these people with an awareness imbued with goodwill, and beginning with them, we will keep pervading the all-encompassing world with an awareness imbued with goodwill. Abundant, expansive, immeasurable, free from hostility, free from ill will. That's how you should train yourselves. So there's a deep point here, and it's in some sense deeply hedonistic, right? The point is, in order to generate any ill will or hatred or animosity or negativity toward another being, be it at the level of physical action or at the level of speech, and even at the level of thought, you have to first generate a certain amount of cognitive dissonance within yourself. And that cognitive dissonance is a necessary precondition before you can share any negative ill will with another being. And that to generate such cognitive dissonance is deeply painful. It's suffering. It's dukkha. That's the Buddhist word for misery or suffering or unsatisfactoriness. It's the problem that the Buddhist worldview is trying to solve. And it goes very deep. And that's why the Buddha in this passage is saying to his monks, no, look, the minute you generate any negativity inside yourself, even if by some third-person description you have every right to do so. If someone's cutting off your limbs with a hacksaw, you might feel that it would be justified that you think lowly of them. But the Buddhist point is like, instrumentally speaking, this is just not practical for you to do, because the second you generate that negativity inside yourself, you're actually multiplying your own misery. And don't do that. Right? So you can already see in your mind how this is going to play out in terms of our attitude towards other beings, including animals. Right? So, let's situate that moral framework within a slightly wider context of Buddhist moral psychology. What's called the Eightfold Noble Path. This is the practical outline of how you ought to work if you're interested in the eradication of suffering. Right? So, what I just showed you, the 5 moral precepts, those fall under the second heading of morality. Right? Now, the Eightfold Noble Path has 3 divisions. Wisdom or panya, morality, sila, and what I call mental discipline, samadhi. Now the order is not fixed. Often you'll see in texts that the wisdom factors come first because the idea there is, well, you have to have a certain level of intellectual understanding before you can take on a moral perspective on the world and then cultivate a mental attitude in light of that moral perspective. But then from a practical point of view, it's often taught, well, no, you have to have the morality fixed first before you can even be calm enough to start to get mental discipline. And then once mental discipline is cultivated, then wisdom can arise. Right? So these things they're linear and dynamic readings. All these things mutually enforce each other. It's not like a step-by-step thing. It's an interpenetrating, interdependent kind of matrix of mental factors that you're trying to cultivate in order to alleviate yourself of a tremendous existential burden that we're all kind of saddled with just by being the finite embodied organisms that we are. So, the important thing I want to keep in mind here is that the Buddhist moral psychology is deeply instrumental, right? It's a hypothetical imperative. It's not a categorical imperative. What I mean by that is the Buddha sort of lays it out. He says, well, look, everyone wants to be happy. If you want to be happy, you should follow this path. This path will lead you to happiness. If not, do what you want. Right? So he's not offering a universal rational justification in terms of like obligations. Like he's not a Kantian about morality. Okay? He's saying, look, we have these goals in our lives, and here's a way to get them. Right? Here's a super refined way to get there, and if you want that, then these are the steps. Okay, so now what we need to do, I want to kind of deepen the analysis of the psychological factors here, just so you have an understanding of how sophisticated the mental topography is. Right? So it's one thing to say, okay, if you get angry at someone, you first have to get angry at yourself, and you might have some intuitive understanding of what that means. But practically speaking, when I say, yeah, don't get angry at the guy who's cutting off your limbs with a hacksaw, you might go, well, okay, but how does that work? Like, why believe that? What's the framework? The main framework that I think is relevant here is what's called the Five Condos, the 5 aggregates. And this is the most basic framework through which Buddhist philosophy analyzes the structure of the mind. Right? So the idea is that all beings are sort of constituted by these 5, kanda means heap, but a good way to think about it is processes. Okay? These kinds of interrelated causal processes. Okay? The first one is physical form. Right? We're all embodied. We all have a spatio-temporal location in virtue of the boundaries of the organism that we are. Right? So that's one factor that constitutes human beings. Another one is sensation or feeling. What that means is that your body is not an inert object. It's a living system that's animated constantly with feelings that are pleasant and unpleasant and sometimes neutral. A good way to figure out what I mean by this is if you just take your hand and press it down on the desk, you're going to feel resistance in your hand. You're going to feel tactile sensations in your hand. Those sensations go through your whole body. You know, when you fall in love or you're in a romantic situation, the fluttering in your chest, it's a very pleasant sensation. When someone says something mean to you and you're tightened, that's a very unpleasant sensation. And then most of the time we just ignore it because there's neutral sensations that are just kind of, you know, bumping along inside of there. Right? The Buddha says, no. These sensations are like the root of the mind. They're the most important things because they condition our responses to the world in ways that largely go unnoticed. Because our consciousness, which is the fifth aggregate, is usually oriented through the sensory receptors out into the world. And we ignore what's going on inside of our own bodies. And the way that ignorance is developed is through these two other factors. The third one, recognition or categorization. It's sometimes called perception. The Pali word is sanya. And basically what that means is the proclivity of the mind to take a whole bunch of things and organize them under a concept. We're constantly doing this. You get all this information coming in through the sensory receptors. It's pleasant, it's unpleasant, and we organize it. We use our concepts to construct maps of meaning that we use to interpret the world. And then what happens is we react to that stuff. We respond. And those responses, those reactions, those are called sankharas. That's the fourth aggregate. And that's sankhara is a notoriously difficult term to translate because what it refers to is a whole bunch of things that are going on in your mind, right? When you see something desirable and then you form an intention or a volition to go and grab it, like when I realize that I'm having an unpleasant sensation in the bottom of my mouth because I've been talking too long without drinking, and then I realize, oh, I'm thirsty. I categorize my experience under a previous experience. I go, oh yes, I'm feeling thirsty now. And then I form the volition to go and grab my water bottle and drink. That's a sankhara. That volitional activity that I form, that's a sankhara. But also sankhara is something like, oh, there's an itch and I just itch it. I just scratch. Right? Because it's just an automatic reflex. Those kinds of automatic cognitive reflexes are sankharas too. And the point that this system is trying to make is that the states of consciousness that arise, that you're aware of through your different sensory receptors, in virtue of which you're in contact with the world, those are buoyed constantly by this process of reaction underneath. You're constantly itching. You sit in a posture in a certain way. Everything about your bodily comportment is a product of your volitional habit formation responding to the hedonic feelings that are coming up in your body. You scratch when it's itchy. You move when it's uncomfortable. You relax when it's really comfortable in that nice big chair that you're waiting to go home to. Right? So this is the framework within which habits of perception and interpretation are formed. Okay? And the point that the Buddha wants to make is that only humans have the capacity to engage with this framework in such a way that they can actually eradicate the proclivity of these factors to generate cognitive dissonance. Right? Other beings, say in higher levels of reality, have so much pleasant sensation that they're not able to actually see clearly the relationships that are existing here. And beings that exist below the human realm are so wrapped up in their automatic instinctual responses to sensory stimuli, say in the animal realm, where it's just like immediate response, that they aren't able to generate a certain level of metacognitive distance required to see how these things are all causally interactive. Okay? So that's the framework. So, now we're going to get more practical. There is a certain sense in which Harris is correct. In that historically speaking, there's not a clear attitude in Buddhism towards animals. And part of the reason for that is because there's two strata of, at least two, but two main ones that we'll think about right now of Buddhists. There are the monks, and then there are the lay followers. And the monks and the lay followers live by completely different rules. So I showed you the 5 precepts earlier, right? That's what the lay followers live by, 5 precepts. The monks live by 227. They're only able to eat food that's given to them. They can't handle money. They don't own anything. The only thing they have is their robes and their bowl. So what that means is that there's no injunction for a monk not to eat meat. Because they have no choice. They're only allowed to eat what's given to them. And that's part of the discipline of renouncing everything, which is, a big part of the Buddhist world model, because the point is we're so wrapped up in the sensory pleasures that the only way to kind of get detached enough to get real enlightenment is to give up everything. So there's a certain sense in which the monks, they just eat what's given. Now there is an injunction which says, as I've quoted here, a monk is not allowed to take meat if they suspect that it's been killed for them. That would be a violation of the first precept. Right? But with the lay people, it's more complicated. And I think Harris is right on this point. Historically speaking, in some countries, vegetarianism is a very laudable position, but it's seldom practiced, even among devout Buddhists. Right? One thing that isn't allowed is living in a trade. Like to be a butcher is not right livelihood. Right? So if you're making a living, financially speaking, by trafficking in the flesh of animals, that's a breach of morality. But it's perfectly acceptable, at least on paper, to go to the store and buy meat. So we need to think about why that might be. What's the reason that the Buddha would lay down very strict rules for the lay followers? Oh no, you're not allowed to be a butcher. You can't traffic in meat, but you can eat it for dinner. Part of the reason I want to suggest for that is because the main point with Buddhist moral psychology is intention. And as long as you're not generating the volition to kill an animal, that first order level, like I'm going to kill this animal right now, then you're okay. Now this seems really weird to us, and I think it's, it's problematic for a few reasons. But the first of which is that, well, you might not have the volition to kill an animal, but you certainly have the volition that someone else did, so you can have dinner, right? So that's like 1 degree of separation, volitionally speaking, right? It's not a lot of distance. But remember, the Buddha's moral psychology is purely instrumental. His point is, here's the minimally sufficient for you to get to where you need to be. And that minimally sufficient degree is, don't kill anything and don't form the intention to kill anything. As long as you're doing that, your hands are clean enough. Now, a lot has happened in 2,600 years. And I think there's a strong case to be made that the amount of technology that we use now and to manipulate animals for the purposes of consumption kind of binds us causally a lot closer to the action of killing them than maybe it did in the time of northern India, 2600 BC. Right? They were all farmers, right? They didn't have factory farms in ancient India. So there's just a question here about how morally charged the causal pathways are between our volitions and the actual people who do the killing. And that's something that's not a clear, there's not a clear position here. And I think that's why I like to do the philosophy, because we have to construct a position based on where we are now in history and construct the Buddhist position in a charitable light. And it's just not easy, right? Because there are all kinds of ambiguities, right? There's the first precept of not killing, but there's also, the acceptance of what's given. So a monk is in this weird position. So the idea is that there's certain doctrinal frameworks that are in place that sort of seem to allow for a meat-eating diet. But then if you look at the actual philosophical framework, it seems that it's not obvious that it's a good way to go given where we are in history, right? And so the way I try and approach it, and I'm just going to put my cards on the table here in terms of my own biases now, is I come at this material from 2 perspectives. One perspective is as a philosopher, right? So I'm interested in saying, okay, what's the best version of this system that we can construct that'll give us, a good approximation of how the world is? And then from another perspective, as a meditator, as someone who spends, a lot of time meditating. And when these 2 things converge, for me at least, I'm very compelled that if you identify as a Buddhist, you ought to be a vegetarian. you really should. It's the most consistent way to be. Regardless of what the texts say. Because the whole idea that doing harm to another is to do harm to yourself, and that it behoves us to do no harm for this reason. Certainly that's going to apply to the animals that are enslaved today in the factory farms. And I see it as a very simple point. And I know some of you have seen this, but really, this video says it better than I ever could. This is profound. Okay?
Tá. Mas come seu nhoque de polvo.
Ah, mãe, tá bom. Esse polvo não é de verdade, né?
Não.
Então tá. Ele nem fala e nem cabeça dele, né? Só tem a cabeça dele.
Não tem cabeça. Isso
Tá
aí é
bom.
só as perninhas do polvo picada.
E a cabeça dele tá no mar?
Tá lá na peixaria.
O monstro cortou assim.
Cortou.
Por quê?
Pra gente poder comer, porque senão a gente ia ter que engolir inteiro.
Mas por quê?
É pra comer, amor. Igual corta o boi, corta a galinha.
Ah, a carinha ninguém come também.
Ninguém come a galinha?
É os animais.
É?
É.
Mas vamos comer o nhoque? Come a batata, então.
Só batata e só arroz.
Tá,
Nem polvo é os animais.
tá bom.
Todos esses são os animais. Peixe é os animais. Polvo é os animais. Cães é os animais. Vaca é os animais. Porco é os animais.
É.
Então, quando a gente comer os animais, eles morrem.
É.
Por quê?
Pra gente poder comer, meu amor.
Porque eles morrem. Não gosto que eles morrem. Eu gosto que eles ficam em pé. É isso.
Então tá bom. Então a gente não vai comer mais não, tá bom?
Tá. Esses animais tem que cuidar deles, não comer.
Tá certo, meu filho. Então come a parte da batata e do arroz.
Tá bom. Por que você tá sonhando?
Não tô chorando, não.
Ah,
Eu tô emocionada com você.
eu tô fazendo uma coisa saindo.
Então come. Não precisa comer o polvo, não, tá?
Tá bom. Então esse povo faz uma carne.
É.
Mãe, eu sou pitanga.
I should say, the view I'm arguing for is not very popular among Buddhist scholars, because the idea that I'm trying to use this video to exemplify is that actually if you just examine the reality, you'll see that it just makes no sense to eat animals. And I'm trying to say, yeah, that's the most coherent Buddhist position, because it just falls right out of the psychology that's in play, right? That if you actually were to consume another creature with full awareness that that was what you're doing, and actually paying attention to the reality of the mental factors that we outlined, you'd actually just see tremendous amount of agitation. And you go, oh, I won't want to do that. Why would I do that? And then you don't, and then you just see the agitation relax. That's the claim I make. Right? There's just a basic, in some sense, selfish reason not to do it, because it's better for you. You'll be happier. You'll just be better off. And part of the reason I bracket that claim is just because there's a proclivity in Buddhist studies to de-emphasize the role that experience actually plays in the interpretation of Buddhist teaching. There's a very common thread in the scholarship which says, like, the focus on meditation, for example, that we all kind of have in our minds as a folk psychological. Like, when you say Buddhist, in your mind you probably think of like some monks, right? But like this is actually So claim some scholars. This is a modernist construction that has to do with all kinds of colonial factors in Southeast Asia and the response to British colonialism. And so empirically speaking, anthropologically speaking, that's all true. Right? But I think we can ask a further philosophical question about what kind of moral position falls out when you actually think about how the psychology works and you try and put that psychology into practice in examining your own experience. Because I'm just going to take it as uncontroversial that that's what Buddhist philosophy wants you to do. And again, I would have to argue that point, but since I'm going to claim authority on the subject in this group at least, I'm going to not argue for it as much as I would have to if I was arguing with my supervisor about it. But it's a coherent position, and I think it's the best position philosophically speaking when we take into consideration the contingent details of where we are now. I'm a little under time, but I think that's good because now we can just talk, which is more fun than just listening to me talk. So why don't we just chat now, and people can just berate me with questions. That'll be good. Yeah.
I have a question, because you said that then Buddhists don't have to be vegetarians, right? Or
I suggested that's the most consistent position for a Buddhist to take.
sure, but if you're talking about causing death or suffering, wouldn't that actually require veganism in the context of factory farms?
It might. That's an empirical question. I'm happy to say yes. I'm not an expert on that. That's not my I'd be happy. I don't think that's obviously false. That could just be true, but I think that's an empirical question. Whereas the point I was trying to make was I was trying to make a conceptual point. I would say that vegetarianism is conceptually entailed by the moral psychology, and it might just be when then you do some empirical research, it just turns out that no, veganism is further entailed by a posteriori. So I'm happy to claim that. And I might be wrong. It might be that full-on veganism is a conceptual entailment of the moral psychology. I'm just not convinced yet. I need to see. I would need to see an argument for that. But I'm sure there is one. I bet Paul has one.
The dairy industry is the same as the meat industry. The dairy cows are killed, the veal cows are taken away, all of that.
That's right. But the point, right? Let me say this. In theory, you could drink milk in a way that isn't you could get non-factory farmed milk, right? That's at least an empirical possibility, even if it doesn't happen.
But even organic farms slaughter their cows after a year and a half.
Okay, but that's an empirical point, right? Plausibly, in ancient India, they didn't do that because they needed the cow for life, right? So you'd have your cow and you just live with it as long as the cow lived, right? So a priori, it seems like you could enjoy the fruits of say milk and eggs, say, without killing the animals, right? Maybe. And then it just might be that we just forgot how to do that, and feel like we need to kill them instead, right? And don't do that.
Theoretically, but we're not in northern India 2,600 years ago, and at the slaughterhouse at Keele and St. Clair, that's where they bring the dairy cows to kill them.
Yeah. So that's completely consistent with what I've said, right? Yeah. I'm making an a priori point about here's a philosophical view about the mind and how and a moral psychology that goes with that mind. And when you think about those relationships, vegetarianism just falls out of that. And then now put that view in 21st century North America, and you go, no, veganism falls out of that.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
I remember debating this with a practicing Buddhist one time who was a meat eater who brought up the middle way argument. You know that one?
Well, the middle way is that's like an epigram for the entire system. So
the idea that I guess he was referring to the monks having to accept what they are given, and that was an example of the middle way that would justify in some circumstances what I was trying to say to him, and I think the gist of what I'm getting from you is that there's, or one of the things you said is that there's, we have to weigh it in terms of the modern context and interpret it in terms of what's going on now, and liking the whole idea of Buddhism, basically.
Yeah. So I would say, like, a monk is living in a different world than we're living in, right? Like a monk. So you have to understand that Buddhist metaphysics is all about causation. Okay, it's all about causal relationships, and it's got a very extended view of what causation looks like. Causation exists between all of us. Causation exists across lifetimes, right? And the Buddhist goal is, at least in early Indian Buddhism, it changed in time, right? But what this is called interdependence, and the idea, or dependent origination, is sometimes how paticca samuppada, and the idea actually is very funny because a lot of us take a lot of solace from this idea that everything's connected, man. Right, and this is some kind of like spiritual truth that people. No, seriously, right? Like that there's unity, and that there are connections between us. That this is a very common theme in many religions, right? Buddhism, early Buddhism says, "Yup," and that's the worst. That's suffering. Like that's terrible that we're all connected, because we're all connected by greed and craving and ignorance, right? So it's a kind of a pessimistic view. And so the Buddhist view is, well, look, there's this causal network in virtue of which we're all connected, and we gotta totally get out of that as soon as possible, right? So for a monk takes a huge step out of that by just like relinquishing their hold on like householder life. And in virtue of doing that, they're at the mercy of the elements and of the generosity of the public. And that's it, right? So there's a certain sense in which monks, they have no preference. They're just like, they take 5 bites of whatever's there, and that's it. They eat 1 meal a day, right? So they're operating on a different ethical trajectory than people who have sort of decided to stay sort of embedded within the causal matrix in a more substantive way. And so for that reason, I would say folks like us we're under stronger constraints, morally speaking, to a certain degree when it comes to animals. Like the monks live under 227 precepts, but we're generating more causal action, right? So we have to be a bit more aware of what the impact is. You haven't spoken yet, so then we'll come back to you.
Like, isn't them stepping outside of like thinking that they're stepping outside of, or trying to step outside of the causation of everything? First of all, really selfish, and then arguably actually hurt, cause, like they want to do like no harm to anybody, but in a way because they're not kind of sharing the weight of all the negativity of everything, then stepping away from it is kind of putting it on us, and then that's harming us in a sense.
It's a coherent argument. I'm not convinced though. Like I've heard this before, and I think it's a consistent claim, but I don't think it goes to the heart of the matter. Because, part of the Buddhist worldview is that the Buddha is the doctor, right? The Four Noble Truths, of which the Eightfold path that I showed you earlier is the fourth. It's just a medical model, right? It's diagnosis. There is suffering. There's the cause of suffering. All right, so it's like there's a problem. There's suffering. Okay, so what's the underlying cause? It's your craving. It's this psychological model being all twisted up. Okay, well, when we look at the causal model, we see, anything that arises due to a cause passes out of existence due to a cause. Therefore, if suffering has a cause, then suffering will pass out of existence in accordance with the law of causation. All right, what's the path that will lead us there? This is the Eightfold path. The Eightfold path is not just for monks. It's for everyone. Anyone can follow it. It's just that a monk takes an extra step to get to the final goal, and in doing so teaches constantly, right? So one of the things that the monk does, they live off the generosity of the lay people. But the lay people benefit from giving to the monk. Like to give food to a monk is an act of enormous merit in Buddhist culture. Because, a householder might not be prepared to give up all their possessions and shave their head and go live in a forest. But by giving to the monk, there's a connection that's established between the monastic order and the laity, in virtue of which the monks actually support the laity spiritually, while the laity support the monks materially. And then there's a causal relationship in virtue of which the monks are able to persist materially and then refine themselves spiritually, and in virtue of that help the householders live a better life. So it's not they're not just like, yeah, see ya, right? Like they're not mean. Like they still interact, they're still around. Like some will go and live in a cave for 10 years, right? But like that's a very rare case. There are monasteries and there's an entire socio-political dimension to Buddhist monasticism, which is deeply ingrained in the cultures they're native to. So, conceptually speaking, it's a coherent criticism, but I think if you look at the way it's empirically in history, you'll see that that's not how it plays out. And that for that reason, the monks are regarded by the laity in many countries, especially in South Asia, as just being like, such wealth, such spiritual wealth for their communities. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
So there's other people. Yeah. Okay. So I think you were next.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
My question is more an extension of his question. So the Buddhists, they believe in no creation God. They believe in no self. And then
The second claim is true, but profoundly complex. So like the anatta, no self or not self doctrine is insanely technical. So like with that caveat, yes.
okay. All right.
Just because like it's amazing. But
So basically, what you
but yeah, no creator God, no soul.
Okay. So when you're saying that there are some things that if you don't do it, it's better for you. So
Yeah. What you?
Okay, for people, okay. And my thinking is, so as soon as the thoughts arise, like desire, or too happy, too sad, that's going to get you in trouble. But so does that mean if you're not doing that, it's going to help? It's not going to help. Because as soon as the emotion or the thought of the desire arises, you're already there.
Well, see, one of the things about the Buddhist psychology is that like there's a high level of training involved, right? So there are stages that exist where like they're described in the text and you can read them, where you can actually get to a stage where like you'll have a negative emotion come up. You see it, it's just there, right? It's not like, oh, I feel sad. It's just like there's some sadness there, right? So there are ways in which the training is supposed to get you to a point of view where you can kind of take a stance on your own mental life that's far more detached than what we normally live.
You foresee it.
Well, it's not that you foresee it. It's just that you're so like in tune with what's going on in your own mind that as things are happening, you just see them in terms of like their structure, right? So a lot of us like when we think like in Western models of the mind, we're really obsessed with meaning, right? So like you're really sad, so you go and you talk to a therapist, and this is good. You should go do this if you're sad. It's helpful. I'm not down on therapy, right? Therapy's cool. Good. And then you talk about all the stuff that happened to you, and you construct a narrative about what happened, and you go, oh yeah, my dad was a dick, and then this other thing happened, and then my girlfriend, and you go through, and we have trauma, and you look at the content of the trauma, and you go, oh yes, I can see now why this habit, this sadness in me, is causally connected to these events that happened in my past. Right? So Buddhism is like, yeah, so that's all true, but forget all the content. Who cares? It's about the structure. Right? There's a causal connection that exists in the structure of mental events, and when you see that structure, the content's just whatever. And so the Buddhists are saying, look, don't worry about the meaning of your mental life, find the truth of it. And the truth of it is that every mental state is impermanent. Every physical state is impermanent. And they are all causally connected and densely interrelated in such a way that they're constantly generating cognitive dissonance and unsatisfactoriness in your life. That's the dukkha. But good news, they're also devoid of any substantial, persistent reality in virtue of the fact that they're impermanent. So if you realize that as it's happening, the hold that these states have on you can be decreased. And in the ideal circumstance, end of the road, eradicated completely. And when that happens, that's what's called vimutti, liberation.
So that's not a state of that you are looking forward to it, that you don't see that, don't feel that at all. It's that you know it, but you're not being affected by it.
Well, the idea is that an enlightened person, a person who's completely liberated from dukkha, that person will experience no cognitive dissonance. They'll experience unpleasant things in the body because the body is...
So it's like a vegetable.
Like, you'll still have pain, but the pain won't cause you any distress. Right? Think about the difference that you have between when you stub your toe and there's pain in the toe and you go, oh, and you just react to it, right? You can totally have pain and just be like, pain. Right? There's bodily damage and it's unpleasant, right? So the idea is that you learn to do that, and then the more you're doing that, the more these kinds of mental states that are really unpleasant and really tangle us up and cause us to do all this self-judgment and all that just stops, goes away.
Does that mean that you are trying to get out of the interdependence?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's where we're going.
I just want to get back to
Yeah.
Ian Harris's article for a sec.
Sure.
One of the issue that I had with him, that I mean, it's interesting and all that, but it was this one line where he says it's just a distortion of the tradition to bring in the ecological interpretation. And what bothered me about that is that if the tradition is living, how can it be distorted? It has to be reinterpreted in light of the modern context, or is that right? What do you think?
Well, that's actually a profoundly complicated question, because different people, different folks have different views about what the status of a tradition is.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a lot of traditions, especially ones coming out of Southeast Asia, like Theravada, especially Burmese Theravada Buddhism, which are really, especially Burmese Theravada Buddhism, as popularized in North America, really see their view as kind of this is Buddha's teaching. It's like an inviolable ahistorical Dhamma, right? And so there's this weird balancing act that has to happen between, and I'm sympathetic to that in the sense that I'm looking for the perennial philosophical vision here, right? Between balancing that, that desire for an inviolable philosophical matrix, and just the demands of historical contingency, right? The demands that historical contingency puts on us now, especially with regard to our attitudes towards animals, is just unparalleled compared to what was going on in ancient India. They had a couple cows with them. Now it's just there are factories. Right? It's just crazy. So I think that that's why we have to be philosophically sophisticated about it, because it's just not obvious that we can just rest in one or the other, because we need to refine the view philosophically to make it respectable to the kinds of explanatory norms we're beholden to now. But then, in addition, we have to, and part of that is sort of a lot of Puritanism for certain traditions. The Pali Canon is the absolute standard. It's it's enshrined. It's the words of Buddha. But then there's this other demand which says, well, no, we face problems now we never faced them. The contours of suffering as they exist now, while structurally the same in terms of how they make life terrible, contingently speaking, they just manifest in all kinds of new ways, which probably just demand different actions of us. Right? The same attitude you got to take towards your own experience to get out of the misery, that is, let go. But the kinds of actions that are demanded of us practically in order to deal with these contingencies, probably very different. And that's part of the asymmetry I see between the kind of textual evidence that says there's kind of an amorphous, not entirely clear attitude towards animals, and now it's like, no, you make that philosophically rigorous, and you say, no, like, at minimum vegetarianism.
And another issue is if we are open to new data, so to speak, and historical contingencies, demands of historical contingencies, I like that line, that the new science of animal ethology might shed light on, might have something to say about the hierarchical model in which animals are a lower rebirth.
I'm less sympathetic to that view, but can you say more?
Well, the idea that there is animal morality, there is animal emotions, that they're not just purely instinctual beings,
right.
that they have minds.
That's right.
You know.
Actually, I read a hilarious article about this today on, I think it was the Globe and Mail, where basically some scientists like hit a camera in like a sea turtle, like a model of a sea turtle, and they observed some dolphins in their natural habitat, and the dolphins were taking this puffer fish and passing it around and chewing on the puffer, not killing it, just kind of chewing it like a piece of gum, because when the puffer fish is compressed to a certain extent, it releases a nerve toxin that, like, in high quantities is lethal, but in small doses get you high. And they're tripping out, like they're passing this thing around, and then they're just like. They're just going up to the surface and like looking at their reflections in like the puddle of water, just like, whoa, and like floating all weird. So it's amazing.
I have a little slide that I should have sent this to you before. It's a Zen Buddhist parable, and I just wrote it up. And it talks about animal sentience. It acknowledges the animal personhood. You want to read it? Do you have a comment on that? Or?
Well, yeah, like, I think that, Buddhist philosophy and on the Western side, Hegel largely, anticipated the theory of evolution, but not with enough precision in the empirical details to like make it do like as much philosophical work as it might have done. And the fact of the matter is there are certain animals, they're coming up. They're pushing their way to levels of cognition that are gonna, in some time be equal to ours. I feel like, how reified are the different levels of orders of beings? It depends on what your explanatory priorities are. I think that there is a strong asymmetry in the sense that, like, chickens can't meditate. Right? They don't have metacognitive detachment. They don't have that. They live in a first order world, and I think that a lot of these other creatures, they have a sense of self. They have a mind. They have a perspective, but they don't have metacognitive access to that perspective as a perspective. They don't have another $10 word. They don't have a transcendental unity of apperception. Right? They can't think about their own thinking. Right? And arguably that's going to be a precondition for being able to take an attitude towards your own mental life and then making a judgment about the nature of that mental life, such that you then adopt a practice or an outlook or a commitment to reorganize that mental life according to a norm. I don't think the dolphins can do that. I think they're just like pleasant sensory experience, right? And they're after that, so like, this is cool. They're probably not at that point. They're probably close. Probably super close.
Dolphins are pretty smart, though.
Yeah, they're probably right there. Like, I think the article, the headline of the article was, or my friend posted it on Facebook, and it said something like, dolphins now demonstrate the intelligence of average human teenager. So, I think that's an empirical question. I think a lot of the categories, especially the distinctions that get made between, animals and humans in the Buddhist framework, that those are open to conceptual revision. According to what our best evolutionary theory tells us about what animal intelligence looks like. And I don't think that's any threat to what's really important about the view.
Yeah, and because we're also animals, of course.
Exactly.
So there's it's not a hard it's not, it's a somewhat arbitrary distinction that's been made, and, yeah.
Everyone wants to talk about the dolphins getting high.
So,
Mine's not actually about dolphins.
Oh, perfect.
So I was wondering, so like say like, you know, you said that you gotta go to different realms, so you weren't like that good of a person, so you get out into the animal realm. How then as an animal would you go to like change realms and if you don't have the ability to like think about your
Good question. Hard question to answer. I think sketch of an answer is going to be that you know what it takes to get to, well, two things. The first thing is that there's no beginning to the Buddhist cosmos, right? We've inherited a worldview which said, you know, we're constantly trying to find the first cause, and then we build out from that, right? We got this big exploded world. We try to scale that back down to a point, right? Buddha says, nope, there's no discernible beginning, right? Which means you have accumulation, karmic accumulation from like innumerable past existences. Which means, you know, say you're reborn as a marsupial. Doesn't mean that you don't have past existences where you were born as a god, right? So the idea is that it's not actually possible for us to construct a linear narrative about, oh, and then the monkey went and gave the other monkey a banana and that was good, and now the monkey becomes a human. Like, those kinds of narratives exist, but they're not, the idea is more is more general than that. It's that there's the causal connected tissue that binds the world together is far denser and more interconnected than most of us would ever imagine. And so, you know, the animal that exists was a human once. You know, the animal that exists was a god once. The animal that exists was every other form of life once. And who knows what that causal configuration looks like. The Buddhist point, I think, is more like human rebirth, super rare. Lots of possibilities there. Make best use of your time. Right? I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah?
just relating to what you just said, we're all the rebirths. Yeah, I remember one of the best arguments I heard for concern for animals or other humans was we are all each other's mother once.
That's right.
And so that means every animal was, you can see the implication. That's the connection.
Yeah. There's that's a common Tibetan anecdote, because in Tibet the relationship between mother and child is very deep. There's a very funny anecdote of this Tibetan monk who came to the West to teach, and someone asked him about that. He's like, no, you don't say that to Western students, because the parental dynamics here are much different. It's like, sister is better, so that everyone's your sister. So yeah, there are different. There are two strands in which like Buddhist ethics kind of go, and I'm not an expert in either one of them. But one of them says, you know, don't do bad things to other people because it's bad for you, right? Because it'll feel bad. If you're paying enough attention to what's going on, you're never going to do a bad thing outside of yourself, because what's going on inside of yourself will just tell you what the right thing to do is. And then the other strand is basically to take this not self idea and extend it out and say, oh, well, I'm not a self and no one else is a self, so we should just promote well-being everywhere as much as possible, because there's no firm locus in which to really ground it, so just put it everywhere. Now, they're not mutually exclusive, but they are two sort of strands that they go out. The more common one is the not-self strand, but I have a friend down at CUNY who's writing a dissertation trying to do the other route, because he thinks it can naturalize that.
Is that closer to engaged Buddhism, or?
No, I'd say engaged Buddhism is more on the not-self side. It's more on the interdependent stuff. The hedonism aspect of it, like the hypothetical imperative aspect of it, it's underrepresented in the literature, I would argue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, the person at the further back first.
Okay, sorry. So when you're talking about how everything's connected and you want to get out of that as soon as possible, after you explained to him his question, I was kind of thinking that they're still connected, so they're not getting out of it. So maybe instead of trying to get out of it, they're trying to convert it to a positive connection instead of a negative.
That's actually a strand of philosophy that is actually developed in subsequent schools of Buddhism. There's a common claims There made a certain strands of what's called Mahayana Buddhist philosophy that say nirvana are actually one thing, looked at from different perspectives. That's not the early view. The early view says there's a deathless state or realm, and like after you die, it's like it's not somewhere you go, right? The idea is like attaining nibbana is like blowing out a candle. No one asks where the flame went. It just went out. You used up the fuel. Right? And the fuel is this cognitive economy that we were talking about earlier, about the constant reaction of the five aggregates. So once you pacify that process, it's just like, yeah. So like that. So the answer is yes. Many Buddhist philosophers subsequently, especially Buddhist philosophy as it developed in China, really took that up. And you'll see that in subsequent strands of Buddhism, but it's not the one that I sort of like. The one that I hold close to my heart is they strongly reject that. The details of which are probably too much for the. But yeah, this person was waiting for some time. I think.
Yeah. There was a story online. I forget if it's in China or in Taiwan. There's a cat who lives in the monastery, and the cat is. Vegetarian, vegan, and in the video they actually tempt the cat with meat, but like the cat doesn't eat it, and oftentimes it would just like sit there with the monks and meditate. And in my experience, I was meditating a lot in the summer, and I was blasting meditation music in my room, and my cat doesn't like loud noises, but he came to my bed and just laid there with his eyes closed, and I know that, you know, he's also experiencing something.
Sure. My cat always sits on my meditation cushion when I'm not around. There's hair all over it. You know. So yeah, they're sensitive beings. There's no denying it, right? Like, no,
I don't think that they don't like. They're just like, you know, instinctual, and that's only it, right? And I think there's more to it than just like. Eating or
it depends on how you define instinct, right? Like arguably we're mostly instinct, like, you know.
Right.
Think about how much of your mental life is just made up of reaction. How much of your life is just automatic, autopilot? Like so much. Like maybe the 20 minutes that you brought, like, well, yeah, like think about like even like going to a lecture. You got maybe 25 minutes of focused attention, and then like it's just period. That's how we're built. Right, and it takes real effort to get through that. Like, so good on you guys, right? So you know, yeah, I don't know. I don't see the idea. I don't see the over-identification of animals with instinct as being too much of an indictment, because I think, oh, look at us, we're kind of the same. Yeah.
Okay, it's a little bit off, but the concept of karma. So how do you explain if someone, or probably a monk, is say walking and they're stepping on ground, but not intentionally.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how does their karma come back to them? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, so look, the idea,
You can erase that.
Okay, so look, the idea is that there's these causal connections, right? Karma is just a word that means action, right? Like, you know, a lot of people think that karma, you know, there's this connotation where they're like, oh, it must have been karma, right? That's just like not what karma is at all. Just so you know, that's not what it means. Yeah, like it's just like, oh man, karma is action. Karma refers to the present moment and the relationship of the present moment to the future. Right? So there's a sense in which what you mean is phala. Phala, it means fruit. Right? The fruit of karma. Right? Karma is action.
But karma is also causality.
Well, yeah, and causality is cause and effect, and causes are now, and effects are future, and the present is an effect of a prior cause, but the karma is the cause, right? It means the word literally means action, right? So the problem is that most people use the term karma to mean result. They think it's like, oh, this is the thing that will happen. Oh, karma. No, that's not. Karma is the thing that generates the result. The result is the fruit of the karma. Okay? So, What about insects? What about bacteria? What about all the life that's just constantly recycled and crushed out of existence just by the furnace of finitude that is the universe? Okay. The answer is something like the following. So here's a karmic. Here's the arrow of karma in all its coarseness. Okay. The idea is that there's something called dharma, right? And the dharma is the law. So karma is a way of thinking about the law of causal relations that exists between current existence and present existence, and it's in samsara, in the conditional world, right? Samsara is the realm of suffering, the entire conditioned universe. Karma is the law about how events transpire across time in a conditioned world, right? Dharma is the law which explains how events that are existing in the conditioned world can eventually terminate in the unconditioned, right? So if there's a monk, he's walking along, and there's little bugs, he's stepping on them. The amount of karmic trajectory that generates is going to be is going to covary with the intention and the amount of suffering that's caused. And the idea, and then the amount of progress that's made, we call it nirvana, right? This is the karmic, and this is the dharmic, okay? The amount of upward, for lack of a better metaphor, because we're all spatio-temporally situated, the amount of upward movement that's made is going to covary according to the amount of virtue, the amount of insight, right? The amount of how much the path factors are cultivated, right? So the idea is like, yeah, you're going to always generate some karma. You're in the world, right? But the amount of purification that's going on, just by being a monk, just the virtue of being a monk, of having renounced the world and have no possessions and taking alms, just that alone is going to generate far more upward momentum than the binding momentum of say crushing an ant that you can't help it, right? You can't, right? So there's kind of like it's very mathematical in that sense.
Isn't it one of the precepts not to walk in the rain or something? I find
There's all kinds of weird little idiosyncratic ones, but like the upshot is like there are small beings that we can't see, and we're crushing them. Like if you see an ant and you run and go, like yeah, you just put the intention to snuff out a light. Bad move.
Another interesting thing is probably you've seen it's on Facebook and all that. The different monks, and this is a long tradition, will canonize a tree or they'll buy a lobster and set it free, and this is a merit issue. But and so in doing that, they seem to be acknowledging the value of the tree or the lobster, independent of its instrumental value from humans.
Yeah.
And but it's for, I presume it's for merit, but it's just an interesting practice that we don't see here.
Yeah, well, they, when you don't have, like, I have a friend who just became a monk, and it's amazing how much time you get on your hands when you give up everything, right? Like you can focus on the minutiae of experience in a way that you weren't before, and those are wonderful deeds. They're good acts, I think. So. I'm running short on time. I have to run to something else after this, but I'm happy to take any final legal questions. Yeah, you've been quite patient. Please.
Okay. One thing that I would be really pleased to hear you address is I wanted to ask if you would argue that that psychoanalysis is fundamentally at odds with Buddhism, like especially with respect to the whole hedonistic aspect of Buddhism, because...
Sorry, the whole hedonistic aspect?
The whole hedonistic aspect, because Cseke, who is a famous psychoanalyst, he argued that psychoanalysis is fundamentally at odds with Buddhism.
Cseke doesn't understand Buddhism at all. Like, I'm sorry, I've read some of his stuff. It's just... Yeah, it's really flat-footed.
Any questions pertaining to the animal issue in the lecture, in particular?
Yeah. I'll answer your question very shortly. I have like a three-word answer, but let's make sure.
It might be a dumb question, but it goes back to the wheel of rebirth, and if like humans are seen as a higher and do something good, born as a human, and lower the animals. Like when you look at the past 200 years. The population of humans has gone from 1 billion to 7 billion, and like in that time we've like destroyed, you know, forests and many species have gone extinct. So like I'm just kind of confused. Like, is there like a little silver lining to that? Like, it means that like more people have done good stuff, so that way there's more humans. But then I guess the reverse, if we're destroying the environment, shouldn't that be a bad thing? And wouldn't we be reborn as like there'd be more trees and animals and less humans, right? It's just, I don't know.
I like it. I like it. It's a great question. That's awesome. That's awesome. Hard question to answer from a Buddhist point of view. Like, I don't, like for me, like, just to put my commitments on the table, like for me, like rebirth, I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't have a view on that, right? Like in terms of like philosophical commitment, it's just like, I'm going to suspend judgment because I just have no way of knowing, right? What would a committed Buddhist monk, they're probably going to have to just bite the bullet and be like, yeah, man, all kinds of beings are totally just like getting on the human bandwagon, right? So there's a weird question about like how much choice there is in getting rebirth, and sometimes you'll hear narratives about people choosing to be reborn and you know whatever, and then sometimes it's just automatic. Those are subtle issues that I don't have the confidence to say anything intelligent about them. But I would say I think this is just a really good example of how just the demands of historical contingency really demand of us to augment our understanding of certain key components of these religions, insofar as our desire is to make them A, philosophically coherent, and B, do practical work for us, like, you know, how do we deal with how shitty life is? Well, you know, let's look at these ancient traditions, maybe they can help us animate those problems. So, but yeah, that's awesome.
So I want to thank, any parting words, you know?
Buddhism is not at all at odds with psychoanalysis. They're just doing two different things, and that are deeply, well, one's concerned with meaning, one's concerned with truth. That's my short answer.
I really want to thank Sean Michael Smith here for giving his time, and he's a very, very engaging lecture. I filmed it, so you'll have a chance to watch it again, and it will be on the test. Possibly.
Yeah, and for those of you who were like, I have a question, just get my email from Paul, and by all means harass me virtually. I'm happy to answer any questions that didn't get resolved. That's fine.
Thank you. You did a great job.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.